Hey everyone. So today, ChatGPT and AI is going to interview me about my new album coming out March 1st. I basically asked ChatGPT to come up with some questions to ask me about the album, and this is what it came up with. So this should be interesting.
Question number 1. What inspired the title KO and how does it relate to the music?
So my friends and I, growing up, played a ton of Super Smash Bros. And in Super Smash Bros, it's all about KOing your opponent before they can KO you. So that's kind of where this album name came from. It was just kind of a flashback to that, and I wanted the album to feel as good as it did for me to KO my opponents in that game. Also, the soundtrack to that game is freaking bonkers. I love the Mega Man's songs with all of the different synths and guitar layers, and like Kirby Air Ride. That song is really cool, and they were definitely like inspirations. Not necessarily as much for this album, but also for just me and music production in general. I wanted to be able to make those really cool types of sounds. So yeah, shout out to Smash Bros, and that's where the name comes from.
Question number 2. Why did you make the decision to self-produce the album and how did it affect your creative process?
I really love the flexibility that self-producing the album gives me in terms of like whenever I want to be creative, I can just go into this office right here and start laying down some tracks instead of having to book studio time that's expensive weeks in advance. I also found that I really like using the audio software itself, in my case Reaper, as an instrument, like adding some sweet guitar effects on a vocal chain, for example, something that maybe you wouldn't do if you didn't have a home recording setup. I also found that I approached songwriting a really different way. So I used to, before doing a lot of recording, would just like get an acoustic guitar and start writing that way. But after really getting into audio recording, I usually start at the software, and maybe it's a cool MIDI chord progression that I really like, or a really cool guitar tone that I came up with to then as like the starting point for the song. So
Question number 3. How do you record music in your home studio?
I have a pretty minimal home studio setup. I'm definitely not as much of a gearhead as some of my other musical friends. And plus, the space that I have to work with is really small, so it's really important to have really high quality over quantity of like the hardware that I choose. So that being said, I have a Rode NT1 microphone running into a Focusrite Scarlett interface and then into my audio production software Reaper. For MIDI and virtual instruments, I'm all in on Native Instruments. I use the Complete Control keyboard as well as the Native Instruments Complete bundle. And for guitar, I have the Headrush pedal board for ambient and effects emulation. Really, just one electric guitar that I use. I have two acoustic guitars, and that's about it.
Question number 4. What is the biggest challenge you faced when creating KO?
So I have musical ADHD, big time. I've got literally hundreds of unfinished music projects. So the hardest part for me in creating the album was picking which songs to focus on for the album that actually went together musically, and then solely focusing on those songs until they were completely finished. I really am happy with how it turned out, but it was tough for me to that constant struggle of like wanting to start new stuff versus finishing existing things and getting them to a state where I can release them. So yeah, that was the biggest challenge.
Question number 5. How did you balance the different roles of musician and producer? And what did you learn about yourself as a musician while making the album?
This is a really interesting question I haven't really thought about before. I guess compared to going through more of a traditional studio, the biggest difference with self-producing is you have to care more about how it sounds more than just how your instrument sounds, right? Like how it sounds in the mix, what effects it uses, if it is too harsh versus another instrument in the mix, things like that. And so it's always like you're constantly balancing between like the musician creative side and producer creative side, as well as like the technical side of like the mixing and editing, and all that comes with music production. So how I've kind of addressed this that works best for me is I'll have dedicated sessions for both. So I'll do a session where I allow myself to be really creative with some musical instruments and not really care about how it technically sounds, and then I'll also have the opposite of that, which is several hour sessions where I won't do any music and just focus on mixing, editing, and all of those types of decisions. So yeah, that works really well for me. If you're a music producer, like let me know in the comments too, like if something else works better for you. I've been going back and forth between doing this and like doing more of like both at the same time. So yeah, let me know what works best for you.
Bonus question: what advice would you give to aspiring musicians who are just starting out and considering self producing their own music?
I would say just do it. It's a really fun way to be creative, and if you're a techie like me, it helps scratch that itch as well. A few things: it's never too late to start. You can get started for basically free if you already have a computer, a pretty good computer. But then past that, you can get a really decent microphone and audio interface for maybe $200-300. It's also really easy to learn nowadays with YouTube at your disposal. If you want to learn Reaper like me, shout out to Kenny Joya on YouTube. He's got, just look him up. He's got hundreds of videos on Reaper and how to do literally anything that you can think about in Reaper. And then finally, remember that when recording, especially digital music, you're not going for perfection, right? You're going for a really creative and fun piece of music to listen to, right? So just keep that in mind, especially when you're using virtual instruments, because it's a really common pitfall to get into where you want everything to sound perfect, but that's not really the best way to do things, if that makes sense. And there's some ways to combat this during your creative process. One is to try to prefer performing over just using or writing MIDI directly with your audio production software, because that'll give it the human performance element. And then as well, if that's not an option, you can do stuff like inject randomness into your sound with there's certain plugins that inject human error, or just add some effects to like some perfect sounding sample to make it sound a little more muddy maybe, or a little less perfect, and that'll make it sound more natural. All right, so that was fun and hopefully interesting. Let me know what other questions you have in the comments below. And KO comes out on March 1st, and really excited to share it with y'all. All right, have a good one.